Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our lectures on the Harvard Classics. We now turn to lecture number 5. This one is on Plato's Apology. I'm very excited about the fact that I get to talk about Plato again. I've given a number of lectures here. We begin now with volume 2 of the Harvard Classics. In the first volume, we were introduced to three great thinkers in Franklin and in Woolman and in Penn. We now turn in the second volume to what is, I guess you could say, kind of predictable, that if you're going to have kind of classics of Western thought, you're going to end up meeting Plato. So we're back to the Greeks, and of course a little bit later in volume 2 we'll see the Romans finishing with Marcus Aurelius. I've got in volume 2 three of my favorite thinkers, Plato, Epictetus, the great Stoic slave philosopher, and then the greatest of the Stoic thinkers, Marcus Aurelius. We'll have more to say about that one later. Here I would just say this though, right away, and hopefully you've already kind of watched my earlier lectures that are listed there for you at Learn Strong down the left-hand side in the Harvard's Classics folder. But if you've already been paying attention with me and been following the previous lectures 1 through 4, you know that I'm very much about taking these texts and recognizing the challenge, the philosophic challenge that's there. And I hope that by the end of our conversations, I'm always challenging you to think about ways in which you can learn from these titles. That's a big deal to me. I hope it is to you as well. Let's begin with Plato's Socrates. Now, I've talked about Socrates before in earlier lectures. I picture him as this old man sitting at the fountain at the mall in Great Theogora there. And two young boys, I imagine, two young gentlemen walking by, one carrying an Abercrombie bag, and the old man Socrates sitting there at the fountain just simply says, "Why Abercrombie?" And the kid carrying the bag says, "Excuse me, dude, I'll wear whatever I want." And the old man Socrates says, No, I'm not interested in what you wear. I'm interested in why Abercrombie." And the kid leaves, but the other kid who's with him stays. This will of course be our Plato character, right? And as a young kid he says, "Well, what's up with, why are you messing with my pal?" He says, no, I really don't care. My question is, why Abercrombie? Well, like, for example, why not down the street at the Walmart? Or even further down the street, why not at the thrift store? Or maybe even the dumpster behind the thrift store, the clothes nobody even wants at the thrift store. Why Abercrombie? And the kid says, well, I don't know, I like Abercrombie too. Like, what's up, what do you got with that? And he says, I think it's not a matter of what you wear, it's a matter of why you wear it. He says, I think a lot of people wear Abercrombie so they can say, in code, I wear Abercrombie and you don't. Power. In other words, I can afford to drop money on a garment. You clearly can't. That makes me more powerful, more of value than you. Of course, the kid at home later, in our contrived story, the mother walks in, he's putting all of his clothes inside of garbage bags. What in heaven's name are you doing? No, this is fine. I've decided I'm no longer going to be defined by the clothes I wear. I'm giving them all away. I'm going to wear thrift store clothes because I don't want to be defined by the clothes. Whoa. First of all, it's thousands of dollars you're throwing away there. Second of all, what are you talking about? No, there was this guy down at the fountain who taught me that. $3.99. It's a huge date. Write it down. 399 BCE. The old man Socrates is brought to trial. He's accused on charges that we'll study here in a moment of being an atheist and a corrupter of the youth. And they kill him. Sitting in the audience in that trial is the very student who stopped there at the fountain with him, Plato. And it will forever change the life of Plato as it's imagined, at least through the literature, because Plato is now going to tell the story of the life of Socrates, and he's going to do it through these amazing dialogues that we get. There's another set of lines in another dialogue called Gorgias where, in the Agora in the Mall, there's this conversation that's happening and Callicles is coming and Socrates sees him, and of course Callicles loathes Socrates because Callicles has no interest in having these kind of conversations. Callicles comes up and Socrates says, I'm so glad that you're here, and he wants to have a conversation with him. And Callicles is like, would you just leave me alone? And Socrates says, no, we're interested in a question that's of great import. We're even told that he reaches out and he grabs him by the arm to hold him for a second, and he says, the question we're interested in addressing is, what course of life is best? Several Platonist scholars have said that with that question or that observation is the beginning of all philosophic inquiry in the West. I love the idea, though, that Socrates cares that much about the question. Of course, we'll talk about this dynamic as the final days of Socrates in the idea of dialogues, exchanges back and forth between usually Socrates and somebody else. An interlocular, to locute means to speak back and forth, interlocular, right? We're also going to learn a lot in our study about what we call argument from analogy, one thing representing another thing. If you've listened to earlier lectures that I've given on, for example, Introduction to 303, I define learning as the capacity or ability to connect new information to old information. And one of the primary ways that that can happen is through questions. The Socratic method of teaching is through questions, and so we're going to see some of that as well. Of course, one of the great questions that's always asked in Platonist study is, well, are we talking about Socrates, who never wrote anything down, okay? Or are we talking about Plato, who is the one that wrote them down? And so sometimes there will be this debate about what is Socratic thought versus Platonic thought. For our study, we're not going to get into that debate. We're just simply going to turn now to the dialogues. Now, in the second volume of the Harvard Classics, we are going to be introduced to 3 of the 4 famous dialogues that comprise the final days of Socrates. Let's outline them quickly for your notes. The first of the 4 is called Euthyphro. Here, we're outside of the court, and Euthyphro and Socrates have a conversation about what is correct action, religious correct action. It's a very interesting dynamic, and it's an exchange, and Socrates is on the outside of the court, about to go into the court. In the second dialogue, the one we'll be talking about, the Apology, Socrates is in front of the court on trial, defending his life, and ultimately being condemned. In 399, he will be found guilty of these charges and will be condemned and put in jail, in preparation, of course, for actually killing him through the drinking of hemlock. The third dialogue that we will study actually together is the Crito, and here we have a student, young pal of Socrates, who shows up and says, I have a way to get you out, let's go, we're going to escape. And Socrates says, let's think about that. Let's have a conversation. And Crito's like, dude, are you serious with me? We got to get out of here. And Socrates says, no. We never want to do anything without first thinking it through. Let's have a conversation. And at the end of that conversation, Socrates has convinced Crito, probably is right for us to not try to escape. The final dialogue of the 4 of the final days of Socrates is called the Phaedo. Here, we are going to hear about Socrates' final words and thoughts. Now, this is a very important dialogue in the history of thought and Western thought, because it is here that Socrates will talk about his understanding of the soul. This will be a very influential dialogue in the history of Christian theology, of course, through St. Augustine. Now, what we want to say about these dialogues, and again, 3 of the 4 we're actually going to study together and read in our Harvard Classics, is we want to pay attention to the ways in which these dialogues are like a symphony of a kind. They are symphonic. They lead us to kind of see all of the different moving parts, the multiple layers that are a part of this. It's compelling for us. Let's now turn to our study of apology itself. The Euthyphro has already been the dialogue that kind of introduces us to the Socratic method, where we're going to have exchanges back and forth. Socrates will ask a question, the answer will be given by the interlocular student, and then Socrates will come back with another question, and then through a course of series of these questions, finally we begin to kind of discover or uncover certain kinds of truths. Now, the Jowett translation is the one that we are working with, and we'll turn now to the opening lines of Apology. And I will just now work with you at level 1, summarizing some of the most interesting ideas from this dialogue apology. Now, let's go ahead and get that out of the way really quickly. Today, for example, if we give an apology, we usually are saying, I'm sorry. That is not what's going on here. Socrates is not saying, I'm sorry for the things I've done. Quite the opposite, we're going to find out. Rather, what he does is he gives a defense, and that's apologia, is a defense of your actions. And so what he's going to say is, this is why I've done what I've done. Now, we are going to pick up with the trial. The charges have already been read out, apparently, and some talking has been done by Miletus, who's going to be the chief spokesperson. And very briefly, Socrates will actually exchange a few words with Miletus. The opening lines will introduce us to the charges. Socrates is being accused of being an atheist. If you want to kill a teacher off, always say that they're an atheist, and of course that he's ruining the youth. Both of these charges Socrates will try to respond to, and right away in the opening lines he will begin. How you felt, the Java translation, how you felt, O men of Athens, at hearing the speeches of my accusers, I cannot tell, but I know that their persuasive words almost made me forget who I was. Such was the effect of them. And yet they have hardly spoken a word of truth. But many as their falsehoods were, there was one of them which quite amazed me. I mean, when they told you to be upon your guard and not to let yourself be deceived by the force of my eloquence. They ought to have been ashamed of saying this, because they were sure to be detected as soon as I opened my lips and displayed my deficiency. Now it goes on like this. Of course, this is the Socratic irony already being introduced. He says, whoa, I can't even believe how good of talkers these guys were, especially Miletus. Almost made me forget who I was. They were so amazing. But they told you I was a good talker, which is of course obvious that they're lying, because I am a terrible talker. Again, Socratic irony. Say one thing, mean something else. We're going to see this all the way through the dialogue. I like to say, and I'll say this later again, I like to say that we will study apology so that we can study the most famous of Plato's dialogues, Republic. Now, I've already given a series of lectures on Republic that are posted at learnstrong.net, but I think that it makes sense to just be reminded that Republic is the most important of the Platonic dialogues, but apology is a great first way to introduce ourselves to how to read this dialogue and how to read dialogues in general by Plato. Let's first of all outline what happens in apology. It's kind of a three-part dance. One, he has to respond to the charges that will be, first of all, as he says them, old charges from the old times. He says, I've been dealing with this garbage about what's wrong with Socrates for a lot of years, including that famous play by Aristophanes, a comic writer, who wrote a famous play called The Clouds, where he basically really lampooned and made Socrates look like an idiot. Lots of people only knew then about Socrates through that dialogue, and so he says, or through that play. And so he says, I have to respond to those people. Then I have to respond to the very, accusers who are right here now and in front of me. About the ones that are in front of him, he says, look, here's the deal for me. I was told by a friend of mine that you all know that he talked with the Delphi oracle. And the Delphi oracle can't lie. It's the gods can't lie. And said about Socrates, he says me, that I was the wisest of all men. And he says, I know that can't be right. And so I went out in search to disprove the gods. So notice the irony. He's being accused of being an atheist. And here he tells us he's going to go out to disprove the gods. But later he will make the observation that in fact he proved the gods right. Because he went out and he talked to people. And he asked them questions. And he found out that the people who thought they were the smartest were the people who didn't know anything. He makes an interesting observation then a few lines into the dialogue where he says, I am better off than those others that I interview. For the other people that I talk to know nothing. And they think they know something. He says, I neither know nor think that I know. Now this is huge. So let's write it down in our notes. One of the most important things that Socrates will say, here again, going back to an earlier comment, the fallibilist position. He says, I'm not an absolutist in my views epistemologically about what I know. Certainly not a relativist, because to say there are no truths is to say one truth. But he says, I'm rather more about this. The one thing I know is I don't know anything. In other words, a healthy skepticism, agnosticism, or fallibilism is a good way to start. In other words, for your notes, humility. He says, Socrates says, it's ironic that he's in this way saying it, because he comes off as obviously conceited as he says it, but I think it's a misreading to see him as conceited. He just simply says, I went out and asked guys questions, they were supposed to know stuff, they didn't know anything. So, obviously, I can say this at least, the one thing I know is I don't know anything, which makes me at least better off than these guys. He will then continue, and he will in fact even begin to evoke the ideas of the great heroes. Namely, the Hercules lines. he wants to quote Odysseus, and let's go ahead and put it in our notes. It is clear that Plato sees Socrates as the new kind of epic hero, a new kind of Hercules. The warrior who doesn't fight with his physical battle arms, but rather with his language, with his words. The Socratic method is the contest with language. And of course the key, and we learned this in Euthyphro right away, is for Socrates always defining your terms. Exactly what is it that's going on? He says that going around and asking questions, this investigation, has led to my having many enemies of the worst and most dangerous kind, Miletus obviously being one of them. We have an examination between he and Miletus, and it's an interesting examination where ultimately Miletus gets trapped into having to say that everybody in Athens are great teachers for the youth except for Socrates. Of course, Socrates turns it around in his argument from analogy and says, yeah, but think about this. If you want to train a pony, we know about this living in Worland, obviously. If you want to train a pony, do you let anybody do it, or do you rather find the expert? And it, of course, will be the expert that Socrates considers himself to be. He will say that it was his philosophic mission. I'd like to go to those lines really quickly as he talks about his mission and the philosopher's mission. He says it this way: I say now, when as I conceive and imagine, God orders me to fulfill the philosopher's mission of seeking into myself and other men. Now this is an important observation that we saw earlier in our lectures from Volume 1. We have a tendency to think that first we have to start solving other people and their problems. No, no, no. The Socratic method begins with, first of all, self-investigation. Yes? Find out about who you are, what we will call perspicacity. There's outside, you can see something outside, and there's insight, or perspicacity. And he says that's where you have to start. The philosopher's mission or goal is, in fact, to go that way. He says it later, just a few lines later, he says, men of Athens, I honor and love you. In other words, I'm not opposed to you at all. But I shall obey God rather than you. And while I have, note the irony, a man who is supposedly an atheist says I have to obey the gods. And while I have life and strength, I will never cease from the practice and teaching of philosophy, exhorting anyone whom I meet after my manner, and convincing him, saying, O my friend, why do you, who are a citizen of the great and mighty and wise city of Athens, care so much about laying up the greatest amount of money and honor and reputation, and so little about wisdom and truth and the greatest improvement of the soul, which you never regard or heed at all? Are you not ashamed of this? Well, we immediately in the American tradition think of Henry David Thoreau, who was greatly influenced by this dialogue and of course the example of Socrates and the idea of the mission. Let's just continue in this vein. And he says, for I do nothing but go about persuading you all, old and young alike, not to take thought of your persons and your properties, but first and chiefly to care about the greatest improvement of the soul. If you are at all studying with me, either here today in 303 or online, think about this. The reason why we are attracted to these kinds of ideas is the very thing Socrates says, to improve your soul. It is a fair question to ask about all the things you're doing. How are you feeding your soul? How are you taking care of evolving as a person in your mind, in your spirit, in your emotions? Socrates will say that's an important part of what we do. He says, I would have you know that if you kill such a one as I, you will injure yourselves more than you will injure me. He says it, you can't hurt me. He says, I am like a gadfly. Now this is his defense. It's ironic, of course. He says, look, the city of Athens is like a big horse. And you guys that are judging me are the horse's rear end. Right, you can see why this is not going to end well for Socrates. Some have argued he obviously had a death wish. He wanted to make sure that he got jacked. Well, it's a debate, but clearly this isn't going to help him get away, is it? You're the horse's rear end, and the horse starts to kind of go to sleep and get lazy. I'm like this big horse flyer, this big gadfly, and I come along and I bite you on the rear end and I wake you up. And for that, you should honor me. You should give me a huge statue in downtown Athens. You should give me some money to retire on. You shouldn't have me in court trying to defend myself. Besides that, he says, I don't have any money anyway because I don't take money like the other sophists who will simply teach for money. Of course, let's go ahead and put it in our notes as well. The value of the gadfly, the value of the nonconformist, the value of the one who kind of wakes us up and says, you can be better. Those individuals often, we think in the history of the world, don't we? We think of Malcolm X, of MLK, and other great thinkers that challenged us, that were gadflies, and yet, of course, important. They go away, they reconvene, and he knows that he's jacked. He knows that the decision has been made. And then in the final words of this dialogue, we will meet the most important lines. Someone will say, Socrates speaking, yes, Socrates, but can you hold your tongue? And then you may go into a foreign city and no one will interfere with you. In other words, instead of killing you, why can't we just exile you? Now, I have great difficulty in making you understand my answer to this, for if I tell you that this would be a disobedience to a divine command and therefore I cannot hold my tongue, you will not believe that I'm serious. And if I say again what the greatest good of man is, here it comes. What is the greatest good, the most important thing we can do? To daily converse about virtue. I hope that as my students, you'll be able to say that in 303, this is at least what we do. To daily converse about virtue and all that concerning which you hear me examining myself and others. And then he says it. And it's a line that I hope you write down and maybe put next to your bed or above your bed on your ceiling, or be reminded of it by memorizing it. He says it this way: the unexamined life is not worth living. Wow. Finally, he says it. I would rather die having spoken after my manner than speak in your manner and live. Whoa. Well, of course, they'll have none of it and they will condemn him. And of course, by the Phaedo, we will hear the famous last words of Socrates. We'll get to that lecture. Let's just work now.